Chapter number 7. Witnessing a miracle. One moment, your life is neat and predictable, with everything in its place, and then a windstorm blows through, and you are left wondering what hit you. Things are never the same again. On a cool, crisp October morning, I had no idea that a huge storm would rage through my life that day. It started out just like any other morning. I sipped my coffee at 5:30 a.m., reading my devotional as I always do. Jamie joined me briefly before shooting out the door to work by 6 a.m. Brian, who was 9 at that time, and Brittany, then 4, woke to a hot breakfast at 6:30. 45 minutes later, Brian was on the school bus on his way to 3rd grade, and Brittany and I were on our way to the daycare I owned and operated. The children at my daycare followed an unsurprising pattern: activities and snack in the morning, and then lunch at noon, followed by story time. Then the little ones would lie on their mats and listen to one of the teachers or me read a story until they fell asleep. I was just finishing a story that day when Sandra, who worked with me at the daycare as a secretary, poked her head in the preschool room and indicated that I should come to talk to her immediately. "I just got a call from Brian's school," she said. "They said to pick him up immediately because he's very ill." Cold dread filled my entire body. I raced to the school and ran inside to the office, where I found my son lying on his side on the floor. I knelt beside him, and then I put my hands on him. I could feel that his body was as stiff as a board. His eyes were open, but they were in a cool, remote stare, as if nothing was registering. Brian was drooling out the side of his mouth, and then he was completely unresponsive to me. Terror now competed with dread. I don't know why the school didn't call an ambulance, but I determined within seconds that my son was in deep trouble. "Let's go now," I yelled at the school secretary, who jumped out of her chair. I picked up my big boy, his body completely rigid, and carried him like a heavy slab of wood to my car, where I laid him in the back seat. For the second time that day, I don't remember being behind the wheel, but I must have been on autopilot. 1,000 deaths. When we arrived at ER, thankfully Brian's was the only emergency the staff had to attend to. There was a nurse with blonde hair who did triage on Brian. I pelted her questions. "What's wrong with him? Why is he so stiff? Is he going to be all right?" She actually broke out in red welts on her face and neck, partly because I was so persistent, but mostly I think because she hadn't a clue what to say to me. And then she knew she couldn't give me an answer I so desperately wanted to hear. "Yes, don't worry. He'll be just fine." After what seemed like hours, but I was really about 20 minutes, Dr. Shelby Smith arrived, guns blazing, to fire off a bunch of orders to the medical staff. "Give him 20 cc's of this and 30 cc's of that," he barked. Don't ask me what he was ordering those nurses to give Brian, but I believe to this day he saved my son's life. Jamie showed up, frantic, just seconds after Dr. Smith, and together we huddled in the waiting room as Brian was examined. When Dr. Smith came out a few minutes later, his face was serious. "Brian had an internal surge, but now it has passed," he said, adding that now our body was in a coma. My Brian registered these details to some degree, but I was in a state of shock. How could this be happening? I had sent a healthy boy off to school in the morning, and now he was comatose. His prognosis unclear, and he was about to be airlifted to New Orleans, where he may or may not ever wake up. A helicopter arrived to take my son to Osner Hospital. As they transferred Brian from the ground to the helicopter with the propeller blades reeling away and medical personnel hustling all around us, I died 1,000 deaths. Jamie and I were not permitted to get on that helicopter. Only the medics could be on board with Brian. Can you imagine what that felt like? To see my unconscious son lifted in the air without me? Numb, I forced myself to turn away from the seat of the helicopter and concentrate on walking to the car. When Jamie and I walked outside the hospital, there was a crowd, about 50 friends and fellow church members gathered to greet us. Brother Steve Eccles from the First Baptist Church had been notified of Brian's sudden illness, and he immediately organized a large prayer chain. Because of my daycare, just about everyone in town knew our family. I had 15 employees, and if you weren't working for me, chances were good that we had helped care for your child. I had nearly everyone's kids in town. Even in my state of shock, I could feel the love and prayers of our community, and those prayers carried us as we drove the hour and a half to the hospital. It was before the days of cell phones, and there was no way to get my information on Brian's condition. Maybe this was a good thing, because there was no news to be had. At any rate, Jamie and I drove in near silence, each mile clicking off on the odometer, bringing us that much closer to our son and news of his fate. When we got to Osner Hospital, Brian was still unconscious, and he would remain that way until 11 o'clock the next morning, when we were notified that he had woken up. When I walked into his room, Brian was sitting up in bed, eating a red popsicle. "Where am I, Mama?" he said. I burst into tears and hugged him as tightly as I dared, relief flooding over me. Within a day, Brian was released from the hospital, and we brought our son home, never to take his life, or the life of anyone we loved, for granted again. As Brian grew up, there were many reminders of this. Hitting the highlights. My son was a fire starter, a daredevil, and at some point during his childhood, it seemed as if he broke every bone in his body. I'm just hitting the highlights here. The year before his illness, when he was 8, Brian had been in a dirt bike accident. I had heard the crash, and when I ran to his crumpled body, the first thing I saw was that his limbs were not lying on a natural position. The second thing I could see was that blood was pouring out his ears. Brian injury. It was all I could think of, and my heart froze in my chest. "Don't cry, Mama," Brian said, blood running all over his face and everywhere. "I'll be all right." He broke his leg, his arm, and all kinds of bones in his head, but thank the Lord there was no brain injury. 4 months afterward, he was in a half-body cast at home, and between me and the pastor's wife, we helped him keep up with his schoolwork at home. That was not the last trauma to be had as a result of that motorbike. A year after Brian's illness, when he was about 10, He fell while riding the bike's exhaust pipe landed on his leg, badly burning him. For months afterward, he had to go to the treatments and they would scrub his burn to clean it so it would heal properly. It was excruciating, and poor Brian would scream his head off while I sat there holding his hand, taking deep breaths and praying so I wouldn't start crying too. I never knew what was going to happen to Brian on any given day. All I knew was that the two of us were too well acquainted with the medical personnel in our area. He also had asthma, which meant many doctors' visits over the course of his childhood. In fact, when Brian had his accident and word spread, 5 doctors left their own practices and came to the ER that day to see if they could help. They all knew us so well. When we checked out of Asner Hospital, no one really had any tight theories about why Brian had had such a life-endangering accident. I have always thought his asthma medications were responsible in some way. We had to give his blood levels checked regularly to make sure nothing was out of balance, and I think he was playing hard on the playground that day and got overheated, triggering his collapse. Dr. Smith was amazed there had been no permanent brain damage, as Brian had been without oxygen for a dangerous amount of time. He had no medical explanation for it whatsoever. No one knew what was wrong with Brian, and at first no one knew how to treat him, but God knew, and that day he listened to the prayers of his people, our friends, family, community, and church members, and I'm guessing even total strangers, and answered by preserving my son. Brian is 31 years old today, healthy and strong. They told us years ago that someone who has a series of the type of Brian has had is prone to have another one, but he never did. I always believed that on that day, 22 years ago now, we encountered more than a windstorm. We witnessed a miracle.